The bar chart shows the percentage of GDP that is spent on healthcare in a number of different European countries over a 10-year period. There is a notable contrast between the different countries' expenditure on their GDP on health, with Switzerland and Belgium spending the largest over the period. This is compared to Lithuania and Estonia, who spend the least, with Switzerland nearly spending 75% more than Estonia as a percentage of their each country's GDPs. Over the 10-year period, the percentage spent on health does not change very much, with some countries increasing: Denmark, Poland, Lithuania, Slovenia, and Norway. But others were decreasing: France, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, what they spent by 1% over the period, and some staying the same. The Netherlands is the only country which spending changes by more than this degree, dropping by 2%. Overall, the amount of money spent on healthcare varied dramatically between many of the different countries. Furthermore, it appears that the amount of money spent by a majority of individual European countries fluctuated between the different years, but not by much. The bar chart shows the percentage of GDP that is spent on healthcare in a number of different European countries over a 10-year period. It is salient to note that there is great variation between the nation-states in terms of expenditure, with high and low levels of spending, as well as increases and decreases over time. Certain countries can be described as high spending compared to their peers. Specifically, Switzerland and Belgium spent the largest proportion over the period, with 11% and 10% respectively. This is compared to Lithuania and Estonia, who spent the least, 4 to 5% and 3%. This means Switzerland almost spent 75% more than Estonia as a percentage of their respective GDPs. Over the period, there was some variation in the percentage of healthcare investment, with increases or decreases of between 1 to 2%. For example, Denmark, Poland, Lithuania, Slovenia, and Norway all saw increases in spending. However, France, Netherlands, and Luxembourg experienced a fall. The Netherlands was the only country where spending deviated significantly, dropping from 10 to 8%. By contrast, certain countries saw no change in the money they allocated to healthcare over the years in question. Spain, 8%, and Estonia, 3%, and fall into this category. Overall, the amount of money spent on healthcare differs dramatically between the different countries. Furthermore, it appears that healthcare spending fluctuates year upon year in many of the countries surveyed. The table shows how men and women who are out of work spent their time last year. The information is broken down into both morning and afternoon, and shows 14 different activities. Housework, shopping, and looking for work were the most common activities in the morning, with nearly half of women doing housework in the morning and a fifth in the afternoon. This figure was much lower for men. Both men and women preferred to do leisure activities in the afternoon. When looking at the difference between sexes, it is also interesting to note that men were more than twice as likely to focus on home improvement, gardening, 14% to 2%, and taking part in sport and walking. However, less productive activities like visiting town, staying in bed, and sitting around were similar for both men and women. Overall, it is clear that the majority of men and women who are not working spend their time on productive tasks such as housework, trying to secure employment, or shopping, with a relative small proportion doing nothing, staying in bed, or drinking. 175. The table shows how men and women who were out of work last year spent their time. The information is broken down into parts of the day and 14 different activities. First of all, it is interesting to note that the majority of both men and women who are unemployed are engaged in productive activities in the morning, with 61% of men and 91% of women either shopping, trying to secure employment, or doing housework, with women being twice as likely to do the latter in the afternoon. However, figures for the afternoon show that the unemployed devote more time to leisure activities such as watching television, visiting friends, or reading. When looking at differences between genders, it seems that men were more likely to be engaged with home improvement, gardening, or active pursuits such as walking or taking part in sports. More sedentary activities such as staying in bed or sitting around were similar for both sexes. Twice the number of men than women spent their time drinking, but this still only accounted for a very small proportion. Overall, It appears that contrary to many stereotypical preconceptions of the unemployed, both men and women do spend a proportion of each day on productive tasks, with there being some interesting differences between genders. The bar chart shows global rates of illiteracy broken down by gender, and also area for last year. It is clear that some areas have a much higher proportion of people who are unable to read or write. It is interesting to note that approximately half of women in South Asia, Arab states, and Sub-Saharan Africa cannot read or write, with the majority of women in South Asia and the Arab states are illiterate. This is compared with roughly a third of men. In the rest of the world, rates of illiteracy are much lower, with nearly everybody living in developed countries being able to read and write, falling to approximately 90% in Latin American and Caribbean countries. However, there are more illiterate women than men, especially in East Asia/Oceania. Overall, although there are great disparitions in literacy across the globe, women are much less likely to be able to read or write. 155. The graphic shows global rates of illiteracy for last year broken down by both gender and area. It is evident that there are great discrepancies in literacy rates according to both geographic location and sex. What is most striking when looking at the data is the fact that the burden of illiteracy is disproportionately borne by women, wherever they hail from. In almost every region on the planet, the number of women who cannot read is significantly higher than the number of illiterate men. In East Asia and Oceania, as well as in the developed countries, it is actually double. Only in Latin America and the Caribbean is there little disparity between the genders and literacy rates. The geographical distribution of education is also plain in this chart. Men everywhere are less likely to be unable to read and write than women. However, in some parts of the world, extremely significant segments of the whole population are illiterate. This is most marked in South Asia, the Arab states, and Sub-Saharan Africa, where approximately half of all women do not possess literacy skills, a lack they share with a third of all men. In East Asia, a fifth of women and 10% of men are uneducated in reading and writing. This is in stark contrast with developed countries, where the proportion of illiterates is truly marginal, even though the absolute number of women is nevertheless double that of men. Overall, we can see that there are great differences in educational provision across the globe, and that, leaving aside Latin America and the Caribbean, the lion's share of illiteracy is given to women.